You expect me to believe this? Officer Derek Mitchell's laughter echoed across the downtown parking garage, harsh and mocking as he held up the police identification card like it was a cheap novelty item he'd found at a dollar store. His flashlight beam illuminated the name and rank embossed on the credential, Chief Marcus Thompson, Metropolitan Police Department. But his eyes saw only what his assumptions told him to see. A black man in maintenance coveralls holding a mop bucket. Someone who clearly didn't belong with an ID that important. Someone trying to run a con that was as transparent as it was pathetic. The parking garage fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene unfolding at 2:30 in the morning. Empty vehicles surrounding them in silent witness to a confrontation that would end at least one career and potentially transform an entire police department. Chief Marcus Thompson, 56 years old with graying hair and weathered hands that bore calluses from the manual labor he still occasionally performed, stood perfectly still with both palms visible and raised slightly in the universal gesture of non-aggression, his body language carefully controlled despite the rage and humiliation burning in his chest, as an officer half his age treated him like a criminal caught in an obvious lie. "Sir, that is my official police identification, and I'd appreciate you radiating dispatch to verify my identity before this situation escalates any further," Marcus said in a calm, measured voice that carried decades of experience de-escalating volatile encounters. Though using those skills on a member of his own department while being treated like a suspect was surreal in ways that made him question everything he thought he'd built over 32 years in law enforcement. He'd been working late in his office reviewing budget proposals when he decided to personally check on a maintenance issue in the parking garage that facility staff had reported, but that seemed to be taking too long to address. Blocked drainage that was creating flooding problems during recent storms. Rather than call maintenance at this hour or wait until morning and let the problem persist, Marcus had simply grabbed coveralls from the facility supply closet and the necessary tools to clear the drain himself. Habits from his youth when he'd worked as a janitor to pay for community college before eventually joining the police force and working his way up through every rank to reach the chief's position 5 years earlier. The coveralls were anonymous and practical. The mop bucket contained tools rather than cleaning supplies, and he'd been absorbed in the unglamorous but necessary work when Officer Derek Mitchell had approached with aggressive suspicion rather than professional inquiry. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Derek said into his radio with barely suppressed amusement, clearly enjoying what he believed was catching someone in a ridiculous lie. "I've got a suspicious person in the headquarters parking garage, black male approximately mid-50s, wearing maintenance coveralls, and in possession of what appears to be a fake police ID, claiming to be the chief of police. Subject is cooperative but insisting the fraudulent ID is legitimate. Requesting backup and a supervisor for processing." The description was delivered with the kind of casual certainty that came from years of making similar calls, years of encountering people in places Derek had decided they didn't belong, based on rapid calculations about race, appearance, and his own assumptions about who did what kind of work in the world. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being black in America settle over him with renewed heaviness. That exhausting reality where your credentials meant nothing if your skin color triggered assumptions that overrode evidence. Where explaining yourself felt simultaneously necessary and futile, because people who'd already decided who you were rarely listened to information that contradicted their preconceptions. "Officer Mitchell, I understand you're following training about verifying identifications and questioning people in secure areas after hours," Marcus said, keeping his voice level despite the humiliation of being treated like a criminal trespasser in his own department's facility. "But I'm asking you to actually look at that ID card carefully, to note the security features that make it impossible to counterfeit, to call your supervisor or anyone in command staff to verify my identity before you do something we're both going to regret. My name is Marcus Thompson. I've been chief of police for this department for 5 years, and I'm personally acquainted with your training officers, your precinct captain, and quite possibly your field supervisor who's probably about to arrive and explain to you exactly how badly you've miscalculated this situation." The information was delivered without heat or threat, just straightforward statement of facts that any reasonable officer would recognize as requiring verification before proceeding with an arrest that would be catastrophically wrong and career-ending if the suspect's claims turned out to be accurate. But Derek Mitchell wasn't listening to words. He was listening to assumptions shaped by implicit bias and reinforced by years of encounters where he'd learned to trust his gut feelings about who belonged where and who was trying to deceive him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Derek commanded, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt with the confidence of someone who believed he was handling a routine arrest of someone caught in criminal activity. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" The Miranda warning was delivered by rote, words spoken thousands of times to countless suspects. No different in Derek's mind from any other arrest, despite the fact that every word was digging his professional grave deeper with each passing second. Marcus felt handcuffs click around his wrists with metallic finality, the cold steel against his skin a physical manifestation of how completely Derek had failed to see him as anything other than what implicit bias had programmed him to expect. A black man in coveralls must be a janitor, and a janitor with a police chief's ID must be a criminal trying to impersonate authority he couldn't possibly legitimately possess. "Officer Mitchell, you are making a mistake that is going to have significant consequences for your career and for this department's reputation," Marcus said, as Derek began walking him toward a patrol car that had arrived as backup. Another young officer emerging with eager curiosity about what his colleague had apparently caught in the act. "I'm not resisting, and I'm not going to fight you. But I need you to understand that what you're doing right now is arresting your own police chief based on assumptions about who I could or couldn't be because of how I look and what I'm wearing. When this gets sorted out, and it will get sorted out very quickly, you're going to have to answer for why you refused to verify information that would have prevented this entire situation, why you chose to trust your biases over actual evidence, and why you treated a ranking member of your own department like a criminal trying to run a con. I hope you're prepared for those conversations, because they're coming faster than you probably imagine." The warning was delivered without malice, but with absolute certainty about how this would unfold once Derek's supervisors discovered what he'd done. Once the truth became undeniable in ways that couldn't be explained away or minimized as reasonable mistake rather than recognized as exactly what it was, racial profiling so blatant that not even police brotherhood would protect Derek from consequences. The second officer, a young woman named Officer Sarah Reeves, approached the situation with visible uncertainty as she took in the scene. Her colleague had clearly made an arrest, but something about the suspect's bearing and calm authority didn't match what she'd expect from someone caught committing crimes in a police facility. "Mitchell, what have we got here?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was hoping for clarification that would make the arrest make sense to her. "Suspicious person with fake ID claiming to be Chief Thompson," Derek replied with confidence that hadn't wavered despite Marcus's warnings, and despite the evidence literally in his hands that should have triggered verification rather than immediate arrest. "ID's actually pretty good quality, but obviously fake since there's no way this guy is actually the chief of police. I mean, look at him. He's wearing janitor coveralls and he was mopping floors in the parking garage. Pretty clear what's actually going on here." The explanation revealed everything about how Derek's mind was working. The logical leaps his bias had made that seemed perfectly reasonable to him, but that would appear catastrophically flawed to anyone not trapped in the same assumptions. If he looks like a janitor and acts like a janitor, then he must be a janitor, and therefore the police chief ID must be fake regardless of what physical evidence suggested. Sarah looked at Marcus more carefully, studying his face with growing recognition that was transforming her expression from curiosity to dawning horror. "Mitchell, I think you should actually check with dispatch on this one," she said quietly, urgency creeping into her voice. "That ID looks legitimate to me, and I think I've actually seen Chief Thompson at community events in civilian clothes. Maybe we should verify before we transport him, just to be absolutely certain we're not making a huge mistake here." Her intervention was cautious, trying to give Derek an exit ramp from the disaster he was creating without directly challenging his authority or making him defensive, but her suggestion that they verify information before proceeding was exactly what Derek should have done from the beginning, instead of allowing assumptions to override professional judgment and basic investigative procedure. Derek waved off her concerns with visible irritation at having his arrest questioned by a junior officer. "Reeves, I've been on the force for 8 years, and I know how to identify fake IDs and con artists. This is a clear case of someone trying to impersonate authority to gain access to secure areas. We're processing him, and he can explain himself to the judge after he's been properly booked and his real identity has been established." Now are you going to assist with transport, or do I need to call for someone else? Marcus watched this exchange with a mixture of professional assessment and personal devastation, analyzing how his own department's training and culture had produced an officer so confident in racial profiling that he would arrest someone rather than spend 30 seconds verifying information that would reveal his mistake. Sarah looked torn between following Derek's orders and trusting her own growing suspicions that this arrest was very wrong. Her internal conflict visible in her hesitation and in the way she kept glancing at Marcus, as if trying to reconcile what Derek was saying with what her own observations were telling her. "Officer Reeves," Marcus said calmly, addressing her directly, "I appreciate that you're suggesting verification, and I want you to know that regardless of how this situation resolves, your instinct to check information before proceeding will be noted positively in my assessment of this incident. But I need you to actually follow through on that instinct, rather than just suggesting it, and then deferring to your colleague's seniority. Call your supervisor right now. Ask them to describe Chief Thompson's physical appearance. Ask them when they last saw me and what I was wearing. Verify before you participate in an unlawful arrest that's going to follow you throughout your career, even though you had reservations about it from the start." Sarah pulled out her radio with trembling hands, clearly understanding that she was at a decision point that would define how this night ended and potentially how the rest of her career unfolded. "Dispatch, this is Unit 15, she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Can you connect me with the duty supervisor? We have a situation in the headquarters parking garage that requires immediate command staff verification before we proceed." The request was met with brief static before a familiar voice came through. Sergeant William Patterson, a 30-year veteran who'd worked with Marcus Thompson for decades and who knew the chief personally from years of collaboration and friendship. "Unit 15, this is Sergeant Patterson. What kind of verification do you need at 2:30 in the morning?" His voice carried curiosity mixed with concern about what might be happening that required supervisory intervention at this hour in what should have been the most secure location in the entire department. "Sergeant Patterson, this is Officer Reeves," Sarah said, shooting a nervous glance at Derek, who was now looking less confident as he began to understand that his arrest might be questioned more seriously than he'd anticipated. "We have a subject in custody who claims to be Chief Thompson, and Officer Mitchell believes the ID is fraudulent and has placed the subject under arrest for impersonation and trespassing. The subject has been calm and cooperative and is requesting verification of his identity before transport, and I'm concerned that we may need command staff input before proceeding because the ID actually appears legitimate to me, and the subject's demeanor doesn't match what I'd expect from someone committing these crimes. Can you describe Chief Thompson's physical appearance for verification purposes?" The question hung in the air of the parking garage, and Marcus could see Derek's face beginning to change as the implications of what Sarah was asking finally penetrated his certainty that he'd caught someone in an obvious con rather than considering that maybe, just maybe, his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. Sergeant Patterson's response came through clearly on the radio, his voice taking on an edge of concern that suggested he was beginning to suspect something had gone very wrong in his department's parking garage. "Officer Reeves, Chief Thompson is a black man in his mid-50s, approximately 6 feet tall, graying hair usually worn short, tends to wear reading glasses that he often keeps on a chain around his neck when not in use. He was working late tonight on budget reviews and mentioned he might personally check on some maintenance issues before heading home because he doesn't like leaving problems for facility staff to deal with in the morning." "Why are you asking me to describe the chief's appearance? Where exactly is Chief Thompson right now, and why do I get the feeling something has gone very seriously wrong that I need to know about immediately?" The description matched Marcus perfectly, down to the reading glasses that were currently hanging from a chain visible above the coveralls he was wearing. And Derek Mitchell's face had gone pale as the reality of his mistake finally became undeniable, even to someone who'd been so certain of his assumptions just moments earlier. Sarah looked at Derek with an expression mixing sympathy and horror, then addressed the radio again with a voice that conveyed the magnitude of what they'd done. "Sergeant Patterson, we need you in the headquarters parking garage immediately. Officer Mitchell has placed Chief Thompson under arrest believing his credentials were fraudulent. The chief is currently in handcuffs and we need supervisory intervention right now." The silence that followed her statement was deafening, broken only by what sounded like Sergeant Patterson dropping something on his end of the radio before his voice came back, no longer calm or measured but sharp, with barely controlled fury. "You did what? You handcuffed Chief Thompson?" "Officer Mitchell, do not move. Do not transport. Do not do anything except remove those handcuffs immediately and wait for me to arrive. I'll be there in 3 minutes, and when I get there, you'd better have a damn good explanation for how this happened." The radio clicked off, leaving Derek and Sarah standing in shocked silence as the full weight of their actions settled over them like physical burden they could no longer avoid or deny. Think about a time when someone made assumptions about you based on how you looked rather than listening to what you told them. Did anyone step up to verify the truth? Or were you left trying to prove yourself to people who'd already decided who you were? Share your story below. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone in these experiences helps us process the anger and hurt they create. Officer Derek Mitchell stood frozen in the parking garage, his hands moving mechanically to unlock the handcuffs around Marcus Thompson's wrists, while his mind struggled to process the catastrophic mistake he'd just made and the career-ending consequences that were now inevitable. His face had transformed from confident authority to ashen horror as the reality penetrated layers of denial and assumptions he'd built up over 8 years of policing that had apparently taught him to trust implicit bias over actual evidence and verification protocols. "Chief Thompson, sir, I apologize," Derek stammered, his voice shaking as the handcuffs finally clicked open, and Marcus slowly lowered his arms, rubbing his wrists where the metal had pressed into skin with unnecessary tightness. I thought I was making a legitimate arrest based on what I observed. The coveralls, the late hour, the ID seemed too convenient. I was following my training about suspicious persons in secure areas." The explanation sounded hollow, even as he spoke it, a desperate attempt to frame racial profiling as reasonable officer judgment, to recast what had actually happened as understandable mistake rather than acknowledging it as exactly what it was. Seeing a black man doing manual labor and immediately assuming he couldn't possibly be someone in authority, despite evidence literally stating otherwise on official credentials. Marcus remained silent as he retrieved his police ID from where Derek had carelessly tossed it onto the hood of the patrol car, examining it for damage before securing it back in the pocket of his coveralls with deliberate care that suggested he was using the mundane action to maintain emotional control while processing his own response to what had just occurred. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Sarah Reeves stood off to the side looking like she wanted the concrete floor of the parking garage to open up and swallow her whole, caught between relief that she'd called for verification before the arrest progressed further, and absolute horror at having been complicit even briefly in handcuffing her own police chief. The sound of a vehicle approaching at high speed echoed through the garage, and moments later Sergeant William Patterson's car screeched to a stop near the scene, the veteran officer emerging with an expression that combined fury, disbelief, and genuine concern for Marcus that transcended rank to speak to decades of friendship and mutual respect being tested by this moment. "Chief Thompson, are you all right?" Patterson asked, addressing Marcus first rather than the officers who'd created this disaster, his priorities clear in that simple choice of who deserved his immediate attention and concern. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he continued working through his own emotional response to being arrested by a member of his own department for the crime of being black while performing manual labor in his own facility. "I'm physically fine, Bill," Marcus said quietly, using Patterson's first name in a way that signaled this was more than just a chief addressing a sergeant, but a friend acknowledging another friend's support in a moment of profound personal and professional violation. Emotionally and professionally, that's more complicated, and we'll need to address it comprehensively once I've had time to process what just happened here. But for right now, I need to speak with Officer Mitchell about his decision-making process, his assumptions, and what this incident reveals about problems in our department that clearly go far beyond one officer's bad judgment. Patterson turned to Derek Mitchell with an expression that promised severe consequences, regardless of whatever explanations or excuses might be offered. "Officer Mitchell, I'm trying to understand how you arrested your own chief of police because he was wearing coveralls and doing maintenance work. I'm trying to understand why you didn't verify the credentials he provided before making the decision to handcuff a ranking member of your department. I'm trying to understand what part of your training suggested that immediate arrest was more appropriate than 30 seconds of verification that would have revealed your mistake before it reached this point. Help me understand, Officer Mitchell, because right now it looks like you saw a black man in work clothes and immediately decided he must be a criminal trying to con you, despite him presenting official credentials and calmly requesting verification before you proceeded. Please tell me I'm wrong about that assessment, because if I'm right, your career in law enforcement is effectively over as of this moment." The words were delivered with cold fury that was somehow more devastating than if Patterson had been yelling, the controlled rage of someone who'd spent 3 decades in law enforcement and was disgusted by what he was witnessing from an officer he'd helped train. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but before he could formulate words that might defend or explain his actions, 2 more vehicles arrived. A patrol car carrying Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez, who served as overnight watch commander, and an unmarked sedan containing Assistant Chief Jennifer Williams, who'd apparently been notified despite the late hour that something significant had occurred involving the chief of police. Both ranking officers emerged from their vehicles and immediately absorbed the scene with the kind of rapid assessment that came from decades of experience reading situations. Marcus Thompson, in maintenance coveralls with the marks of handcuffs still visible on his wrists. Derek Mitchell looking like he might be sick at any moment. Sarah Reeves standing at attention with barely controlled distress evident in her posture. And Sergeant Patterson radiating barely contained fury. "Someone explain to me what happened here," Lieutenant Rodriguez demanded, her voice cutting across the parking garage with unmistakable command authority. "And it better be a good explanation, because I just got a call from the duty sergeant saying one of my officers arrested the chief of police, which sounds impossible and insane. So I'm hoping there's been some massive miscommunication." Sergeant Patterson provided a concise summary of events based on what he'd learned from radio traffic and his brief conversation with Marcus, his account making clear that Derek Mitchell had ignored multiple opportunities to verify Marcus's identity before proceeding with arrest, had dismissed concerns raised by Officer Reeves, and had operated from beginning to end based on assumptions about who Marcus could or couldn't be, based primarily on his appearance and the manual labor he was performing. As Patterson spoke, Assistant Chief Williams's expression transformed from confusion to absolute fury, her face reflecting both personal anger at what had been done to a colleague she respected and professional concern about the liability and public relations disaster this incident represented for the department. "Officer Mitchell, I want to be absolutely clear about something," Williams said when Patterson finished his summary. "You didn't arrest a stranger who turned out to be the chief of police. You arrested the chief because your implicit bias told you that a black man in coveralls doing manual labor couldn't possibly be someone in authority, regardless of what his credentials stated. That's not a mistake. That's racism operating through police procedures. And it's exactly the kind of behavior we've been trying to address through training and policy reforms that you apparently slept through or dismissed as political correctness that didn't apply to your gut instincts and your assumptions about who belongs where in our society." Marcus held up his hand in a gesture that silenced further recriminations, at least temporarily. "Assistant Chief Williams, Sergeant Patterson, Lieutenant Rodriguez, I appreciate your support and I share your concerns about Officer Mitchell's conduct tonight. But I need some time to process this experience before we make final decisions about discipline or career consequences. This isn't just about one officer making a bad arrest. This is about systemic issues in how we train officers to see people, how we evaluate threats, how we determine who belongs in certain spaces, and who gets viewed with suspicion, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Officer Mitchell's actions tonight were wrong and will have consequences, but he's also a product of a system and a culture that I've been responsible for overseeing. If our training and our culture allowed him to reach the point where arresting his own chief seemed like reasonable judgment, then we've all failed in ways that require honest examination, rather than just punishing one individual and pretending the problem has been solved." His words reflected the kind of systems thinking that had made Marcus an effective police chief, the ability to see beyond individual actions to the patterns and culture that produced those actions, though in this moment that analytical capacity was competing with personal hurt and humiliation that no amount of professional detachment could fully shield him from experiencing. Officer Sarah Reeves stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying urgency that demanded attention. "Chief Thompson, sir, I need to say something. When I arrived as backup, I had concerns immediately about Officer Mitchell's assessment of the situation. Your demeanor didn't match what I'd expect from someone committing crimes. Your ID appeared legitimate to me, even though I'm not an expert in document verification, and something about the entire situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I suggested to Officer Mitchell that we should verify with dispatch before proceeding, and he dismissed my concerns as inexperience and told me to either assist with transport or leave. I called for verification anyway, but I should have done it sooner. I should have pushed back harder. I should have refused to participate even as backup until verification was complete. I failed you, and I failed the standards we're supposed to uphold. And I take full responsibility for my role in allowing this to progress as far as it did before intervention occurred. Her confession was raw and honest, acknowledging complicity, even as she'd been the one whose actions ultimately prevented the situation from escalating to full transport and booking into the system. Marcus looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed appreciation for her honesty with concern about the position she'd been placed in by her partner's actions. Officer Reeves, you did call for verification despite pressure from a more senior officer to simply follow his lead. You trusted your instincts enough to push for confirmation, even when it was uncomfortable to question your colleague's judgment. That took courage, and it ultimately prevented this incident from becoming even worse than it already is. I want you to remember this night when you're faced with similar situations throughout your career, when your gut tells you something is wrong, when your observations don't match what a senior officer is telling you, when you have to choose between going along with what's happening and speaking up to demand verification or intervention. You did the right thing tonight, even though it came later than ideal, and that matters more than you probably realize. His words were meant to be encouraging, but they were also implicitly critical of Derek Mitchell, whose seniority and experience should have made him the one exercising better judgment, rather than requiring a junior officer to override his assessment. Derek had remained silent through these exchanges, his face reflecting the internal struggle of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error, but was also grappling with cognitive dissonance between his self-image as a good officer and the racist actions he'd just committed. Chief Thompson, I need you to understand that I wasn't trying to profile you or treat you differently because of race, he finally said, his voice carrying defensive desperation rather than genuine reflection or accountability. I saw someone in maintenance coveralls in a secure area at an unusual hour, and yes, the ID seemed suspicious because maintenance workers don't usually carry police credentials, and I made a judgment call based on my experience about what was more likely, that you were actually the chief doing manual labor yourself, or that someone had stolen or faked credentials to gain access to police facilities. I chose wrong, and I'm sorry for that, but it wasn't about race. It was about the totality of circumstances, and making a decision based on what seemed most probable, given what I was observing. The explanation revealed how thoroughly Derek had internalized the kind of colorblind racism that claimed to see no race while consistently making decisions that disadvantaged people of color, that insisted bias wasn't operating even when patterns of differential treatment were undeniable. Officer Mitchell, let me ask you something, Marcus said, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge that hadn't been present before. If you'd encountered a white man in maintenance coveralls with police credentials claiming to be a captain or a lieutenant, would you have immediately arrested him as you did me? Or would you have been more inclined to verify the credentials before making that arrest, perhaps assuming that someone with official identification was more likely to be who they claimed, rather than automatically jumping to the conclusion that the ID must be fake? Because I've been a police officer for 32 years, and I've observed countless interactions where white officers encounter white people in unexpected contexts or unusual circumstances. And somehow those situations almost always get resolved with conversation and verification, rather than immediate handcuffs and arrests based on assumptions about deception. The totality of circumstances you're describing as race-neutral included the circumstance of my skin color, whether you want to acknowledge that or not, and that circumstance overrode all other evidence, including official credentials, that you decided must be fraudulent because your assumptions about who could be a police chief didn't include someone who looks like me doing manual labor in coveralls. The accusation of racism made Derek visibly defensive, his body language shifting from chastened acceptance of error to resistance against characterization of his motives as racially biased. Sir, with all due respect, I've never had a complaint about racial profiling in my 8 years on the force. I've arrested people of all races based on their behavior, not their appearance. I have black friends. I've worked with black officers. I don't have a racist bone in my body. What happened tonight was a mistake in judgment, but it wasn't racism. It was situational assessment that turned out to be wrong, and I apologize for that. But I'm not going to accept being labeled a racist when that's not who I am or how I operate. His response was textbook defensive denial, complete with the black friend's defense that had been mocked countless times, but that people still deployed when accused of racial bias. Completely missing the point that racism operated through systems and assumptions, regardless of individual intentions or conscious beliefs about racial equality. Assistant Chief Williams stepped in before Marcus could respond to Derek's defensive deflection. Officer Mitchell, the fact that you've never had a formal complaint doesn't mean you've never engaged in racially biased policing. It means the people you've subjected to that treatment either didn't know how to file complaints, didn't believe complaints would be taken seriously, or couldn't afford the personal and professional costs of challenging a police officer's conduct. And your insistence that you're not racist because you have black friends or colleagues completely misses the point of what implicit bias is and how it operates. You don't have to consciously hate black people or hold explicit white supremacist beliefs to engage in racist policing. You just have to operate from unconscious assumptions about who belongs where, who's likely to be committing crimes, who deserves benefit of the doubt, and who should be viewed with immediate suspicion. Those assumptions are shaped by culture, media, training, and lived experience in a society with deep racial inequalities, and they operate automatically unless we actively work to recognize and counter them. Chief Thompson is standing here in handcuff marks because your implicit bias told you that black man in coveralls must be a janitor, and janitor with police chief credentials must be a fraud. Despite zero evidence of actual criminal behavior beyond your racialized assumptions about what was plausible. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been quietly observing the exchange, and she now addressed the group with the measured tone of someone thinking through immediate logistics while emotions were still running high. Chief Thompson, what do you need from us right now? Do you want medical attention to document injuries from the handcuffs? Do you want Officer Mitchell placed on administrative leave immediately pending investigation? Do you want to file formal charges against him for false arrest? Do you want us to secure this scene and begin collecting evidence for internal affairs investigation? Help us understand how you want to proceed. Understanding that what happens in the next few minutes will shape how this incident gets investigated and resolved. Her questions were practical and necessary, focused on ensuring proper protocols were followed, and that Marcus's rights as the victim of this incident were protected, even as his role as chief complicated the dynamics of how it would be handled. Marcus took a deep breath, rubbing his wrists one more time before responding. Here's what I need right now. Officer Mitchell, you're suspended immediately pending full internal affairs investigation. Officer Reeves, you're on administrative duty pending investigation of your role as backup officer, though my preliminary assessment is that your actions in calling for verification may have prevented this from becoming even worse. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I want complete documentation of this incident, including photographs of my wrists, statements from all parties, security camera footage from the parking garage if it exists, and radio traffic records. Sergeant Patterson, I need you to personally oversee the internal affairs investigation to ensure it's thorough and unbiased despite the fact that I'm the victim. Assistant Chief Williams, I need you to start thinking about what this incident reveals about our training gaps and cultural issues, because Officer Mitchell's actions tonight suggest we have systemic problems that go far beyond one individual's poor judgment. He paused, his expression reflecting exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness to encompass emotional and spiritual weariness that came from experiencing racism from within his own department. And for myself, I need to go home, talk to my wife about what happened, and figure out how I'm going to lead a department where apparently an officer can see me in coveralls and immediately assume I'm a criminal, rather than considering that maybe the chief sometimes does his own maintenance work. As the ranking officers began implementing Marcus's instructions, and Officer Mitchell was escorted away by Sergeant Patterson to begin the administrative leave process, Sarah Reeves approached Marcus one more time. Chief Thompson, I know this probably isn't the right time, but I need you to know something. I became a police officer because I believed in service, because I wanted to protect people, because I thought I could make a difference in my community. Tonight showed me that believing in those things isn't enough if I don't have the courage to act on them when it matters most. When speaking up means challenging people with more authority and experience. I'm going to do better. I'm going to be the kind of officer who interrupts racism when I see it, who demands verification before allowing assumptions to drive arrests, who uses whatever privilege I have as a white woman to push back against the kind of bias that led to you being handcuffed tonight. I promise you that. Her voice cracked with emotion, and Marcus could see genuine anguish in her face as she grappled with her own complicity and her determination to learn from this traumatic lesson. "Officer Reeves, hold on to that commitment," Marcus said gently. "You're going to face situations throughout your career where doing the right thing costs you something. Relationships with fellow officers, career advancement opportunities, comfort and belonging within the Blue family that values loyalty over justice. The test of your commitment will be whether you continue speaking up and demanding better, even when it's costly, even when you're called a traitor or accused of not supporting your fellow officers, even when it would be so much easier to just go along with what the senior officers are doing, rather than questioning practices and assumptions that harm the communities we're supposed to serve. Can you do that? Can you be the kind of officer who values accountability over blind loyalty?" His question was genuine, not rhetorical, because he'd seen countless well-intentioned officers lose their commitment to reform once the costs became clear and the path of least resistance beckoned with promises of easier relationships and smoother career trajectories. Sarah met his eyes and nodded with determination that seemed genuine even if it remained to be tested by future challenges. "Yes, sir. I can. I will. Tonight you were the victim, but you used that experience to teach me something about what kind of officer I want to be. I won't waste that lesson, even when living up to it costs me something." Marcus believed her in that moment, though he also knew that conviction expressed in crisis sometimes faded when crisis passed, and the daily grind of policing presented countless opportunities to look away from injustice in service of personal comfort and professional advancement. Time would tell whether Officer Sarah Reeves would become the kind of police officer who actually challenged racist systems from within, or whether she'd gradually be absorbed into those systems and lose the moral clarity that allowed her to see tonight's incident for what it actually was, rather than accepting defensive explanations that minimized harm and protected the status quo. As Marcus finally left the parking garage still wearing his maintenance coveralls, his police credentials secured in his pocket and his wrists bearing the marks of handcuffs applied by one of his own officers, he carried weight that went beyond personal humiliation to encompass broader questions about what it meant to be a black police chief in America, whether transforming law enforcement from within was actually possible, and how to address systemic racism when it manifested so blatantly that even the chief wasn't protected from being treated like a criminal based on assumptions that his skin color and his work clothes activated in an officer's biased mind. Marcus Thompson sat in his home office at 4 in the morning, still wearing the maintenance coveralls that Officer Derek Mitchell had used as evidence that he couldn't possibly be who his credentials claimed. His wrists now bandaged where the too tight handcuffs had broken skin and left abrasions that would serve as physical reminder of this night long after emotional wounds had presumably healed. His wife Jennifer had listened to his account of being arrested by his own officer with expressions that cycled through disbelief, rage, and devastating recognition that even her husband's position and authority couldn't fully protect him from the racism that black men navigated daily, regardless of their accomplishments or rank. 32 years you've given to that department," Jennifer said, her voice thick with anger and hurt on Marcus's behalf. 32 years rising through every rank, proving yourself over and over, leading with integrity and commitment to reform. And still, one officer sees you in work clothes and immediately decides you're a criminal trying to con your way into police facilities, rather than considering that maybe, just maybe, the chief does his own maintenance sometimes. How do you come back from that? How do you walk into that building tomorrow and lead officers who clearly some of them see you as less than? See you as someone who couldn't possibly belong in leadership unless you've somehow tricked or manipulated your way there? Marcus didn't have good answers to her questions, because he was struggling with the same doubts himself, questioning whether transformation from within was actually possible, or whether the system was so fundamentally broken that working within it just meant perpetuating harm with slightly better intentions than officers who didn't even pretend to care about reform. "I knew intellectually that implicit bias training and policy reforms weren't sufficient to address systemic racism," Marcus said slowly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I knew that changing hearts and minds required more than mandatory workshops and updated procedure manuals. But I believed, maybe naively, that my presence in leadership, that having a black chief who'd risen through the ranks and understood both the community's concerns and the officers' challenges, that this would make some meaningful difference in how policing happened on the streets. Tonight showed me that Derek Mitchell looked at me and saw a threat, saw someone who didn't belong, saw a criminal to be arrested rather than a leader to be respected. If I can't even be seen as legitimate by my own officers when I'm literally carrying credentials that prove my authority, then what hope do we have of changing how those same officers see black teenagers in hoodies, black professionals in nice cars, black families in their own homes? Jennifer moved to sit beside her husband, taking his bandaged wrists in her hands with the gentleness of someone handling something precious that had been damaged through violence. Marcus, you've spent 3 decades trying to reform policing from inside, trying to be the change you wanted to see, trying to protect black communities from the kind of officers who see us as threats rather than citizens deserving protection. Tonight proved that even you aren't safe from that mindset, that your badge and your rank only protect you when officers bother to verify them rather than operating from assumptions about who could or couldn't hold authority. So maybe the question isn't whether you can come back from this, but whether you should. Whether it's time to acknowledge that the system can't be reformed from within because the rot goes too deep, because the culture eats reform efforts for breakfast and produces officers like Derek Mitchell, who can work for 8 years without anyone apparently noticing or addressing his racial bias until it became so blatant that he arrested his own chief. She paused, tears forming in her eyes. I'm scared for you, Marcus. Scared of what this job costs you every day, even before tonight. Scared that you'll burn yourself out trying to fix something that maybe can't be fixed. Scared that next time it won't be handcuffs but bullets. Because if Derek Mitchell can't recognize you as the chief despite credentials, what happens when an officer encounters you in civilian clothes somewhere and decides you're a threat to be neutralized? The fear Jennifer was articulating was fear that every black person in America understood viscerally. The knowledge that credentials and accomplishments and following every instruction couldn't guarantee safety when implicit bias told officers to see threats rather than human beings deserving respect and benefit of doubt. Marcus had counseled countless black parents about having the talk with their children about how to survive police encounters, had delivered eulogies for young black men killed by officers who claimed they'd feared for their lives despite video evidence suggesting otherwise, had implemented training programs designed to reduce use of force disparities, while watching those disparities persist because training couldn't overcome culture and assumptions that ran deeper than conscious policy could reach. And now he was facing his own reckoning with the limits of reform, his own moment of confronting whether continuing to work within a system that had just victimized him was noble persistence or self-destructive denial of realities he couldn't change through individual effort and good intentions. I can't quit, Marcus finally said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wished he felt. If I leave now, if I let this incident drive me out of leadership, then Derek Mitchell wins. The officers who don't believe black people belong in positions of authority win. The culture that produces racial profiling and discriminatory policing wins. And the communities that I've committed to serving lose whatever modest protection my presence in leadership provides. Whatever incremental progress we've made on accountability and transparency and community engagement. I know that sounds like ego or martyrdom, but I genuinely believe that having black leadership matters even when that leadership can't single-handedly solve systemic problems. Even when that leadership faces racism from within its own ranks. Someone has to keep fighting from inside, keep pushing for change, keep holding officers accountable even when it's exhausting and demoralizing and apparently insufficient to prevent situations like tonight from happening. Jennifer squeezed his hands gently, her expression mixing support for his decision with continued fear about its costs. Then I support you staying, but I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll actually take care of yourself through this process, that you'll talk to someone about the trauma of being arrested by your own officer, that you won't just push through and pretend you're fine because chiefs have to project strength and control. Promise me you'll recognize when the costs are becoming too high and be willing to reassess whether staying is sustainable for your health and our family's well-being. And promise me you'll use this incident to demand real change rather than just accepting Derek Mitchell's discipline and moving on as if systemic problems have been addressed by punishing one individual. Her demands were reasonable, but also challenging, requiring Marcus to acknowledge vulnerability and limits that police culture typically treated as weakness, rather than recognizing as necessary components of sustainable leadership and personal survival in hostile environments. By 6 in the morning, Marcus had showered, changed into a full-dress uniform instead of his typical suit, and prepared to return to police headquarters, knowing that word of his arrest would have spread throughout the department, despite it being early morning hours. The choice to wear formal uniform rather than civilian clothes was deliberate, reclaiming his authority visibly, making his rank undeniable even to officers whose implicit bias might otherwise lead them to question his legitimacy. He arrived at headquarters to find Assistant Chief Jennifer Williams already in his office, coordinating response to an incident that had generated urgent calls from the mayor's office, the city council president, and multiple community organizations who'd somehow already heard about the chief being arrested by his own officer and were demanding immediate public accountability. "Chief Thompson," Williams said as Marcus entered, relief evident in her voice despite the crisis they were managing. "The mayor wants a briefing in 2 hours. The police union is already preparing statements defending Officer Mitchell, and we've received 17 media inquiries about the incident asking for confirmation and comment. How do you want to handle communications?" Marcus settled behind his desk, wincing slightly as his bandaged wrists reminded him of why they were dealing with this crisis in the first place. "We're going to be completely transparent about what happened, because anything less than honesty will make this worse when full details inevitably emerge through leaks or public records requests. Draft a statement that confirms I was arrested by Officer Derek Mitchell in the parking garage while performing maintenance work, that I was handcuffed before my identity could be verified despite presenting credentials and requesting verification, that Officer Mitchell has been suspended pending investigation, and that this incident has prompted comprehensive review of our implicit bias training and procedures for verifying credentials before making arrests. Make clear that I hold no personal animosity toward Officer Mitchell, but that his actions reflect systemic training failures and cultural issues that extend beyond individual misconduct to require institutional examination and reform." He paused, considering how to frame what had happened in ways that would resonate with different audiences who would interpret the incident through their own prior beliefs about police and racism. "And make clear that I'm using my own experience with racial profiling to push for changes that will protect community members who don't have my credentials or position to eventually prove that officers' assumptions were wrong." The statement was drafted, reviewed, revised to strengthen rather than soften language about racism and implicit bias, despite Williams' concerns that explicitly naming race would provoke backlash from officers who would claim the chief was playing victim or undermining morale. "Jennifer, I appreciate your caution about how officers will respond," Marcus told his assistant chief. "But I'm not going to minimize what happened or pretend it was race-neutral mistake in judgment, rather than acknowledging it as racial profiling that happened to target someone with enough power to ensure consequences. If we can't call racism what it is when it happens to the chief, how can we expect officers to recognize and address it when it happens to citizens with far less protection? The discomfort of officers who don't want to confront implicit bias is less important than the safety of community members who face this treatment constantly without any recourse or accountability." His determination to name race explicitly, rather than hiding behind euphemisms, reflected evolution in his own thinking, accelerated by experiencing firsthand what he'd previously understood only intellectually from community complaints and statistical analyses of disparate treatment. Sergeant William Patterson arrived with the preliminary internal affairs investigation file, documenting the incident through witness statements, radio traffic transcripts, and security camera footage that had indeed captured the entire encounter from multiple angles. Watching himself be handcuffed on video was surreal and traumatic. Seeing from external perspective what he'd experienced subjectively in the moment, the casual certainty with which Derek Mitchell had dismissed his credentials, the visible contempt in the officer's body language as he'd applied handcuffs with unnecessary force, the way Derek had laughed while radioing about catching someone with a fake police chief ID, completely confident in assumptions that would be revealed as catastrophically wrong within minutes. "The footage is damning," Patterson said quietly. "It shows clearly that you were calm and cooperative throughout, that you repeatedly requested verification before arrest, that you identified yourself multiple times, and that Officer Mitchell proceeded based on assumptions rather than evidence. It also shows Officer Reeves expressing concern and calling for verification despite Mitchell's resistance, which supports her account of trying to prevent escalation once she recognized something was wrong." Marcus watched the footage multiple times, analyzing it both as victim processing trauma and as chief examining training failures and cultural problems that had produced this incident. Bill, I want you to expand this investigation beyond just Derek Mitchell's actions to examine his training history, his field training officers, his supervision over 8 years, any prior complaints that might have been dismissed or minimized, patterns in his arrest records that might show disparate treatment based on race even if no formal complaints were filed. I want to understand how we produced an officer confident enough in racial profiling to arrest his own chief, how that confidence was built through years of apparently successful policing that never faced meaningful accountability for bias in decision-making. And I want recommendations for systemic changes that go beyond disciplining one officer to address the culture and training gaps that made this incident possible. His instructions reflected understanding that individual accountability was necessary but insufficient, that real change required examining systems that produced Derek Mitchell and hundreds of other officers whose bias might not manifest quite so dramatically, but who nonetheless contributed to discriminatory policing patterns that harmed Black communities daily. The mayor's briefing 2 hours later was tense and difficult, with Mayor Rebecca Hamilton oscillating between genuine concern for Marcus's well-being and political calculation about how this incident would play publicly and whether it threatened her own re-election prospects given that police reform had been central campaign promise. "Marcus, I'm horrified by what happened to you and I want you to know you have my full support," Hamilton said, her words carrying sincerity mixed with careful political positioning. "But I'm also concerned about how this incident will be perceived by different constituencies. Community members who've been demanding police accountability and reform will see it as confirmation that the department has deep-rooted racism problems even in leadership, while police unions and law and order advocates will claim you're overreacting or playing race card to punish an officer who made honest mistake. How do we navigate this in ways that serve justice, while also maintaining public confidence in the department and in your leadership?" Her question revealed the political calculations that always complicated efforts to address police racism. The way achieving accountability required balancing multiple interests and constituencies rather than simply doing what was right, regardless of political consequences. "Madam Mayor, with respect, I'm not interested in navigating this politically," Marcus said firmly. "I'm interested in using my own experience with racial profiling to drive reforms that protect community members who face similar treatment constantly without my advantages of rank and credentials. If that costs me politically or makes some constituencies uncomfortable, that's acceptable, because the alternative is allowing racist policing to continue unchallenged while we prioritize public relations over justice. Officer Mitchell arrested me because he saw a Black man in coveralls, and his implicit bias told him I couldn't possibly be the chief, despite credentials explicitly stating otherwise. That's textbook racial profiling, and it's exactly what community members have been complaining about for years while being told they're oversensitive or that officers' actions were justified by circumstances. My incident proves what Black communities have always known, that credentials and compliance don't protect against bias, that officers make split-second judgments based on racial assumptions, and that those assumptions get defended as reasonable law enforcement even when they're demonstrably wrong. I'm not going to soft-pedal that reality to make it more palatable for audiences who don't want to acknowledge how pervasive racism is in policing." Mayor Hamilton absorbed Marcus's response with visible concern about the political implications, but also apparent respect for his principled stance. "I support your commitment to transparency and reform, but I need you to understand the political realities we're navigating. The police union is already preparing to defend Officer Mitchell aggressively, framing this as chief overreacting to innocent mistake and using race card to punish officer who was following training. Conservative media will amplify that narrative, and it will complicate our broader reform efforts if you're spending all your energy defending yourself against accusations of being divisive or anti-police. I'm not saying don't pursue accountability. I'm saying be strategic about how you frame issues and build coalitions to support changes you're demanding. Can you do that? Can you channel your anger and hurt into effective reform advocacy rather than letting it become liability that undermines your credibility and effectiveness?" Her question was fair, even if Marcus found it frustrating, because she was right that achieving lasting change required building support rather than alienating potential allies through approaches that seemed vindictive or self-serving, even when they were actually principled responses to genuine harm. "I'll be strategic, but I won't be silent," Marcus agreed. "Officer Mitchell racially profiled me, and I'm going to use that experience to demand changes that benefit everyone who faces similar treatment. If the police union wants to defend racial profiling, they're welcome to make that argument publicly and see how it plays with communities who've been demanding accountability for exactly this kind of behavior. And if conservative media wants to frame my pursuit of justice as race card or anti-police bias, they can do that. But they'll have to explain why verification of credentials before arrest is somehow unreasonable standard, or why expecting officers not to operate from racial assumptions is asking too much. I'm confident that transparency and honesty will serve us better than trying to manage narratives and minimize what actually happened to protect political interests or police morale. His determination reflected both principle and strategic calculation that in an era of cell phone cameras and social media, attempts to cover up or minimize racist incidents typically backfired more spectacularly than honest acknowledgement and commitment to reform, though success depended on following through rather than just making promises that faded once immediate pressure subsided. The public statement released that afternoon was direct and unambiguous, describing Marcus's arrest in clear terms, explicitly naming race as central factor in Officer Mitchell's decision-making, and committing to comprehensive reforms including enhanced implicit bias training, revised credential verification protocols, independent review of arrest patterns to identify officers showing disparate treatment based on race, and creation of advisory commission, including community members with authority to review internal affairs investigations and recommend discipline. The response was immediate and predictably divided. Community organizations and civil rights groups praised Marcus's transparency and commitment to accountability. Police unions condemned what they characterized as rush to judgment against officer who'd been following training. And media coverage split along familiar ideological lines, with some outlets treating incident as evidence of systemic racism, while others framed it as isolated mistake being exploited for political purposes. Officer Derek Mitchell, through his union attorney, released his own statement denying racial bias and claiming he'd been following legitimate security protocols that anyone in his position would have applied regardless of suspect's race. I made a judgment call based on what I observed, someone in maintenance coveralls in secure area at unusual hour with ID that seemed inconsistent with their apparent role, Mitchell's statement read. The fact that the individual turned out to be Chief Thompson doesn't change that my decision-making process was sound, based on information available at the time. I regret that my actions caused embarrassment to Chief Thompson, but I was doing my job as trained, and I won't apologize for following protocols designed to maintain facility security, even when those protocols sometimes result in mistaken identifications that get quickly corrected through proper verification processes. The statement carefully avoided acknowledging any role for racial bias, while framing the arrest as following proper procedures, ignoring the fact that those procedures explicitly required verification before arrest, and that Mitchell had proceeded, despite having credentials in hand that should have prompted verification rather than immediate handcuffing. Officer Sarah Reeves also released a statement, though hers took very different tone from Mitchell's defensive denial. I failed Chief Thompson, and I failed the standards I pledged to uphold when I took my oath as police officer. When I arrived as backup and observed Officer Mitchell's interaction with Chief Thompson, I had concerns immediately about whether we were handling the situation appropriately. I should have intervened more forcefully to demand verification before any arrest occurred. Instead, I deferred to my partner's seniority and experience, suggesting verification but not insisting on it until the situation had already escalated to handcuffing. I called for supervisory verification as soon as I found courage to do so, but my hesitation meant Chief Thompson spent minutes in handcuffs that he should never have worn. I'm grateful Chief Thompson has expressed confidence in my desire to learn from this experience and become better officer, but I understand that words are meaningless without changed behavior. I commit to being the kind of officer who interrupts bias when I see it, who demands verification before assumptions drive arrests, and who values accountability over blind loyalty to fellow officers. I hope my actions going forward will demonstrate that commitment more clearly than my failures did on the night I allowed my chief to be arrested by his own department. Her statement generated significant attention for its contrast with Mitchell's denial, with many commentators praising her accountability, while others within law enforcement criticized her for what they saw as throwing her partner under the bus and betraying the solidarity that supposedly bound officers together regardless of individual actions. The polarized responses to nearly identical incident, Mitchell defended for following training, Reeves criticized for breaking ranks, revealed how deeply police culture valued loyalty over accountability, how admitting error and committing to improvement was treated as weakness or betrayal, rather than recognized as integrity and professional growth that should be encouraged rather than punished. 3 weeks after Chief Marcus Thompson's arrest by Officer Derek Mitchell, the internal affairs investigation concluded with findings that were both damning in their specificity and troubling in their broader implications about department culture and training. The investigation documented not just Mitchell's actions on the night in question, but patterns throughout his 8-year career showing consistent disparities in how he treated citizens of different races. Black and Latino drivers were significantly more likely to be pulled over by Mitchell than white drivers, even when controlling for violation rates and neighborhood demographics. Searches during traffic stops showed dramatic racial disparities, with black drivers being searched at 3 times the rate of white drivers. Despite white drivers being slightly more likely to actually have contraband, use of force reports showed Mitchell employing physical force against black suspects at rates significantly higher than against white suspects in comparable situations. The data painted picture of officer whose racial bias had operated throughout his career, producing discriminatory outcomes even when no individual incident had generated formal complaint or triggered supervisory intervention. This investigation reveals that Officer Mitchell's arrest of Chief Thompson wasn't an isolated incident or aberration from otherwise exemplary policing, Sergeant William Patterson reported to command staff during closed-door briefing on findings. It was entirely consistent with patterns in his policing that we failed to recognize or address because we weren't systematically analyzing officer behavior for racial disparities, because individual incidents got explained away as reasonable responses to specific circumstances, and because complaints from community members, when they were filed at all, got dismissed as sour grapes from people who'd been legitimately arrested or cited. Officer Mitchell operated for 8 years with apparent success by metrics we were tracking: arrest numbers, citation rates, response times, while engaging in racially discriminatory policing that our systems weren't designed to detect or address until it became so blatant that he arrested his own chief based on racial assumptions. Patterson's analysis was scathing in its implications not just for Mitchell, but for department leadership, including Marcus himself, suggesting systemic failures in oversight and accountability that allowed biased policing to flourish as long as it didn't generate political embarrassment or legal liability that couldn't be managed quietly. Marcus absorbed the findings with mixture of vindication and devastation. Vindication that the investigation confirmed racial profiling rather than accepting Mitchell's characterization of incident as reasonable mistake. Devastation that his own department had apparently been engaging in discriminatory policing that he'd failed to recognize or address adequately, despite years of reform efforts and policy changes intended to promote equity and accountability. These findings suggest we need to fundamentally rethink how we evaluate officer performance and identify problems before they reach crisis levels, Marcus said to his command staff. We've been measuring things like arrests and citations without adequately examining who's being arrested and cited, whether similar behaviors by people of different races generate similar responses, whether our officers are treating all community members equitably regardless of race. We've created systems that reward productivity without interrogating whether that productivity is being achieved through discriminatory practices that harm Black and brown communities while getting defended as reasonable law enforcement. That changes now. We're implementing comprehensive analysis of every officer's stop patterns, search patterns, use of force patterns, with particular attention to racial disparities that suggest bias even when individual incidents can be explained away through circumstantial factors. And we're creating accountability for supervisors who fail to recognize or address disparities among officers under their command. The discipline recommended by Internal Affairs for Officer Derek Mitchell was termination based not just on the arrest of Chief Thompson, but on demonstrated pattern of racially discriminatory policing throughout his career that violated department policy and constitutional requirements for equal treatment under law. The police union immediately filed grievance challenging termination as disproportionate discipline for what they characterized as single incident that hadn't resulted in any charges being filed or any injury beyond temporary embarrassment, conveniently ignoring the 8 years of discriminatory patterns that investigation had documented. The union's defense strategy focused entirely on the specific incident with Chief Thompson, while dismissing broader pattern analysis as statistical manipulation, designed to justify predetermined outcome based on chief's racial grievance, rather than objective assessment of officers' conduct. Officer Mitchell made judgment call that turned out to be wrong, but judgment calls are part of policing and officers can't be fired every time they make decisions that with benefit of hindsight weren't optimal, the union attorney argued during grievance hearing. The fact that Chief Thompson is black and Officer Mitchell is white doesn't transform legitimate security concern into racial profiling, and the statistical analysis of past stops and searches is flawed methodology that doesn't account for relevant contextual factors about where Officer Mitchell was assigned and what behaviors he was responding to in those encounters. The arbitration hearing to resolve the termination dispute became proxy battle over broader questions about police accountability, implicit bias, and whether racist outcomes required racist intent, or whether patterns of discrimination could exist, even when officers claimed non-racial motivations for individual decisions. Marcus testified extensively about his own experience being arrested and about the patterns investigation had revealed in Mitchell's policing history, his testimony walking careful line between expressing personal hurt and maintaining professional focus on policy violations and constitutional concerns rather than individual animosity toward officer who'd arrested him. My concern isn't that Officer Mitchell consciously hates black people or deliberately set out to discriminate, Marcus testified. My concern is that his implicit biases shaped his perceptions of threat and his judgments about when force and arrest were necessary in ways that produced dramatically different outcomes for black citizens compared to white citizens in similar situations. Those disparate outcomes violate our policies. They violate constitutional requirements for equal protection, and they damage community trust in ways that undermine public safety, even if every individual decision can be defended through post hoc rationalization about specific circumstances. We can't allow officers to continue policing with biases that produce these kinds of patterns, regardless of their stated intentions or their belief that they're treating everyone fairly. Officer Sarah Reeves also testified, describing her observations the night Chief Thompson was arrested and her own complicity in allowing situation to escalate before finally demanding verification. Her testimony was particularly powerful because it came from fellow officer acknowledging rather than defending problematic conduct, offering insider perspective on how police culture discouraged challenging senior officers' decisions even when those decisions seemed wrong. I knew immediately something wasn't right about how Officer Mitchell was handling the situation, Reeves testified. Chief Thompson's demeanor was calm and authoritative in ways that didn't match what I'd expect from someone committing crimes. His credentials looked legitimate to me even though I'm not expert in document verification. And something about Officer Mitchell's certainty that credentials must be fake, despite having no evidence beyond his assumptions about who could or couldn't be police chief. That troubled me in ways I initially couldn't articulate, but that I now recognize as witnessing racial profiling in action. I should have trusted those instincts and intervened more forcefully, instead of deferring to Officer Mitchell's experience and seniority. The fact that I hesitated reveals how police culture teaches us to value loyalty to fellow officers over accountability to communities we serve, and how that culture enables discriminatory policing by making it professionally risky to challenge colleagues' decisions even when those decisions are clearly wrong. The arbitration ultimately upheld Mitchell's termination, finding that pattern of discriminatory policing combined with egregious incident of arresting his own chief constituted just cause for dismissal that wasn't disproportionate to misconduct that had undermined department integrity and community trust. The decision was significant victory for accountability efforts, though it was also immediately appealed through additional legal channels and generated renewed backlash from police unions and conservative media who framed termination as politically motivated retaliation by chief who couldn't accept honest mistake without turning it into racial grievance. The narrative warfare around incident revealed how deeply entrenched resistance to police accountability remained, despite decades of reform efforts, and despite mounting evidence that implicit bias produced discriminatory outcomes, requiring systemic intervention rather than just individual discipline when cases became too egregious to ignore. Marcus used the momentum from investigation findings and arbitration decision to push for broader reforms he'd outlined in initial public statement, implementing comprehensive early intervention systems that tracked officer behavior patterns and triggered supervisory review when disparities emerged, requiring supervisors to justify disparate outcomes, or implement corrective action, including additional training or reassignment to reduce harm. The reforms faced significant resistance from officers who resented increased scrutiny, and from union representatives who claimed reforms constituted harassment and micromanagement that would make it impossible to do effective policing. "You're asking us to second-guess every decision in real time based on racial statistics," one officer complained during implementation training. "If I stop more black drivers than white drivers in areas where more black drivers are present and engaging in violations, that's not racism, that's geography and probability. But under these new systems, I'll be flagged for racial profiling and subjected to investigation, just for doing my job in communities that happen to be predominantly black. That's not fair, and it's not effective policing." The complaints revealed how thoroughly many officers had internalized narratives that framed accountability as anti-police harassment rather than recognizing it as necessary oversight to ensure equitable treatment and constitutional policing. Marcus addressed these concerns directly during department-wide meeting on reforms, his own experience as victim of racial profiling giving him credibility that made it harder for officers to dismiss his perspective as outside criticism from people who didn't understand realities of policing. "I understand that increased scrutiny feels uncomfortable, especially for officers who believe they're treating everyone fairly and don't consciously harbor racial bias," Marcus told the assembled officers. "But I need you to understand that impact matters more than intent, that producing discriminatory outcomes is a problem even when officers claim non-racial motivations, and that the communities we serve experience our actions based on cumulative patterns, not on individual officers' stated intentions. When black drivers in your patrol area are being stopped at 3 times the rate of white drivers for similar violations, when black suspects are experiencing force at dramatically higher rates than white suspects in comparable situations, when black families are calling police for help and instead experiencing hostile treatment that makes them regret seeking our assistance, those patterns matter regardless of whether any individual officer believes they're being racist. And those patterns undermine public safety by destroying trust between police and communities we're supposed to serve." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing with more personal appeal. "3 weeks ago, one of your fellow officers arrested me because he saw a black man in coveralls, and his implicit bias told him I couldn't possibly be the chief despite credentials explicitly stating otherwise. I know many of you believe Officer Mitchell made honest mistake, that he was just being cautious about security, that race wasn't factor in his decision-making. But I was there. I experienced his contempt, his certainty that I was lying, his refusal to verify information that would have immediately revealed his mistake. And I've now seen the data on his policing patterns throughout his career, showing that his treatment of me was entirely consistent with how he treated black citizens generally, with suspicion, with assumption of criminality, with quickness to use force and arrest, rather than de-escalation, and giving benefit of doubt. If that can happen to me, with all my rank and credentials and decades of service, imagine how it feels for black teenagers, for black parents, for black professionals who don't have my protections, and who experience similar treatment with no recourse and no accountability when they try to report discrimination. That's what we're trying to address through these reforms. Not to make your jobs harder, but to ensure we're treating all community members equitably regardless of race." The speech resonated with some officers while generating resentment from others who interpreted it as chief playing victim card or exploiting his own incident to impose politically correct restrictions on effective policing. The divided response reflected broader cultural battles within law enforcement about whether racial bias was a serious problem requiring systemic intervention or overblown concern being exploited by activists to hamstring police and coddle criminals. Marcus understood he wasn't going to convince everyone, that some officers would resist accountability regardless of evidence or appeals to fairness, but he believed that creating systems to detect and address bias could reduce harm even when it couldn't transform every officer's beliefs or eliminate all resistance to reform. The work was exhausting and often discouraging, facing opposition from officers who should have been allies in pursuit of constitutional policing and equitable treatment. But the alternative was accepting status quo that produced incidents like his own arrest and countless worse outcomes for community members without his privileges and protections. The Community Advisory Commission he'd promised in his initial statement was established 6 weeks after his arrest, bringing together civil rights advocates, community organizers, religious leaders, and residents from neighborhoods that experienced highest rates of police contact to provide oversight and input on department operations. The commission's first meeting was contentious, with community members expressing skepticism about whether civilian oversight would have real authority or just provide cover for business as usual, while appearing to address concerns through symbolic reforms lacking teeth. Chief Thompson, we appreciate that you experienced racial profiling, and we're glad you're using that experience to push for changes, one commission member stated during opening session. But you're still police chief who's part of system that produced Officer Mitchell and hundreds of other officers whose bias harms our communities daily. What guarantee do we have that this commission will have real power to demand accountability rather than just serving as fig leaf that gives appearance of community input while department continues operating as it always has? We need specific commitments about what authority this commission will have, what information will access, what happens when our recommendations conflict with department preferences, and how you'll demonstrate that civilian oversight means something beyond public relations gesture. Marcus had anticipated this skepticism and came prepared with specific proposals that went beyond typical advisory commissions with limited access and no enforcement authority. This commission will have access to all internal affairs investigation files, all use of force reports, all complaint data, including complaints that don't result in sustained findings, because I want you to see patterns, not just individual incidents that generate discipline. You'll have authority to interview officers and review body camera footage when investigating specific incidents or examining broader patterns. Your recommendations about discipline and policy changes will be made public, and I'll be required to either implement them or publicly explain why I'm declining, which creates accountability through transparency, even when we disagree about specific measures. And most importantly, you'll have authority to recommend budget allocations for training, equipment, and community programs, which gives you leverage beyond just criticism to actually shape department priorities through resource decisions. This isn't perfect accountability. You don't have power to fire officers or unilaterally implement policies, but it's real authority that goes significantly beyond what most civilian oversight bodies have, and I'm committed to defending your access and your role even when it's politically uncomfortable, or when your recommendations challenge department practices I've previously defended. The commission members appreciated specific commitments while maintaining healthy skepticism about whether promises would survive first serious conflict between community priorities and department resistance. The work ahead was extensive and uncertain, requiring sustained engagement from community members who had jobs and families and limited time to devote to oversight activities, requiring Marcus to defend civilian authority against officers who would resent outside interference, requiring honest confrontation of problems that police departments typically preferred to manage privately rather than exposing to public scrutiny and criticism. But the alternative was continuing to operate without meaningful external accountability, continuing to allow incidents like Marcus's arrest to be treated as isolated aberrations rather than symptoms of systemic problems requiring systemic solutions, continuing to ask Black communities to trust institutions that had repeatedly demonstrated they couldn't be trusted without robust oversight and real consequences for misconduct. As Marcus sat in yet another evening meeting 8 weeks after being arrested by his own officer, watching community members and police supervisors debate implementation details of reforms that were simultaneously too radical for some and too modest for others, he felt bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness to encompass emotional and spiritual weariness of trying to transform systems from within while facing resistance from all sides. But he also felt renewed sense of purpose, born from his own experience with racial profiling, understanding in ways he'd only grasped intellectually before, how urgently change was needed, and how high the stakes were for communities that depended on police for protection, but too often experienced them as threats rather than guardians. 6 months after Chief Marcus Thompson's arrest by Officer Derek Mitchell transformed a parking garage maintenance task into a catalyst for department-wide reform, the changes implemented in response to that incident were beginning to show measurable impacts on both officer behavior and community trust. Though the work remained incomplete and contested by forces resistant to accountability and transparency, the comprehensive early intervention system tracking officer behavior patterns had flagged 37 officers whose stop rates, search patterns, or use of force showed statistically significant racial disparities, requiring supervisory review and corrective action. 22 of those officers had completed enhanced training and shown subsequent improvement in their interaction patterns with diverse communities, while 15 remained on modified duty, pending additional evaluation and decisions about their continued employment given persistent disparities despite intervention efforts. The data-driven approach to identifying problematic patterns had generated significant backlash from police unions, claiming the statistical analysis was flawed and that officers were being punished for doing their jobs in high-crime neighborhoods that happened to be predominantly non-white. But Marcus had remained firm that discriminatory outcomes required explanation and correction, regardless of officers' stated intentions or claims about contextual factors. Officer Derek Mitchell had exhausted his appeals, and his termination had become final, making him a cautionary example within the department about consequences of racial profiling, even when victims couldn't prove discriminatory intent through mind reading, but could demonstrate discriminatory patterns through behavioral evidence spanning years of policing. Mitchell had attempted to find employment with other law enforcement agencies, but discovered that being fired for racial profiling after arresting your own chief created reputational damage that made him effectively unemployable in policing, regardless of how vigorously the union defended his actions as reasonable under circumstances. He'd eventually taken a security job in private sector, posting occasionally on social media about how political correctness had destroyed his law enforcement career and martyred him for following training that any reasonable officer would have applied regardless of suspect's race. His ongoing victimhood narrative found sympathetic audience among people who viewed police accountability as anti-cop harassment, but it also served as reminder to active officers that pattern of discriminatory policing would now generate real consequences, rather than being tolerated as regrettable but acceptable cost of aggressive law enforcement. Officer Sarah Reeves had been cleared of misconduct after investigation determined her call for verification had ultimately prevented situation from escalating to full transport and booking, and she'd been promoted to field training officer position, where she could shape next generation of officers with lessons learned from her own failure to intervene more forcefully when witnessing problematic conduct. Her training approach emphasized importance of questioning assumptions, demanding verification before arrests, interrupting bias when observed in fellow officers, and valuing accountability over blind loyalty to colleagues who might be engaging in misconduct. I tell every recruit about the night I watched my training partner arrest our chief, because his implicit bias told him that black man in coveralls couldn't possibly be someone in authority. Reeves shared during training session observed by Marcus as part of his ongoing assessment of reform implementation. I tell them how I had concerns immediately, but deferred to his experience and seniority instead of trusting my own instincts that something was wrong. I tell them how those minutes of hesitation meant our chief wore handcuffs he should never have worn, and how my failure to act more decisively makes me complicit in his humiliation, even though I eventually called for verification. And I tell them that being a good officer means being willing to challenge bad policing, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you relationships with fellow officers, even when it would be easier to just go along with what senior officers are doing rather than insisting on verification and accountability. The Community Advisory Commission had evolved into significant force for accountability and transparency, reviewing dozens of cases where community complaints had been dismissed by internal investigations, uncovering patterns that suggested some investigations had been perfunctory rather than thorough, and recommending policy changes that addressed gaps in oversight and discipline. The Commission's quarterly reports were made public, generating media coverage and community discussion that kept pressure on department to sustain reform efforts, even as initial attention faded and other issues competed for public focus. Martha Williams, a retired civil rights attorney who chaired the commission, had become vocal advocate for transparency and had developed working relationship with Marcus built on mutual respect, despite their sometimes different perspectives on how quickly change could be implemented and what compromises were acceptable in service of incremental progress versus holding out for more comprehensive transformation. Chief Thompson, I want to acknowledge the significant progress your department has made in 6 months since your arrest, Williams said during their monthly meeting to review commission activities and department responses to recommendations. The early intervention system is identifying officers with problematic patterns. You've implemented discipline for sustained misconduct. You've been transparent about challenges and setbacks rather than just promoting successes. That's real accountability that goes beyond what most departments achieve even after high-profile incidents that should prompt reform. But I also need to be honest that 6 months isn't sufficient to declare victory or assume changes are sustainable. We're seeing some officers game the system by reducing stops overall, rather than addressing bias in who they stop. We're seeing supervisors defend problematic officers through creative interpretation of data. And we're hearing from community members that while some interactions have improved, many officers still approach black neighborhoods with suspicion and hostility rather than partnership. The work is ongoing, and the Commission's role is to maintain pressure even when it's exhausting for everyone involved. Marcus appreciated her balanced assessment that recognized progress while refusing to declare mission accomplished prematurely. Martha, I share your concerns about sustainability and about officers finding ways to comply with letter of reforms while evading spirit of equitable treatment. That's why I've proposed making the early intervention system more sophisticated, to detect not just disparities in stop rates but also disparities in how officers conduct those stops, how long encounters last, what language officers use, whether interactions escalate unnecessarily, whether searches are conducted based on legitimate probable cause or fishing expeditions based on officers' assumptions about who's likely to be carrying contraband. We're also implementing community survey system where residents who have police encounters can provide feedback about how they were treated, giving us data beyond just formal complaints that require significant effort and risk to file. The goal is creating multiple feedback mechanisms that make it harder for officers to hide discriminatory practices and easier for supervisors to identify problems before they reach crisis levels. The community survey system Marcus described was still in pilot phase, being tested in 3 neighborhoods with different demographic compositions and different histories of police-community relations. Initial results were revealing significant gaps between how officers believed they were treating community members and how those interactions were actually experienced by residents, particularly in predominantly black neighborhoods where even respectful professional encounters carried undertones of suspicion and control that white neighborhoods rarely experienced. One survey response captured the disconnect poignantly. The officer who stopped me was polite and didn't use force or say anything overtly racist. But he pulled me over for allegedly rolling through a stop sign on my own residential street where I've lived for 15 years. He ran my license and registration through his system looking for warrants or violations, even though I hadn't done anything to suggest I was a dangerous criminal. He searched my car after claiming he smelled marijuana even though I don't smoke and nothing was found. And he kept me detained for 25 minutes for a stop sign violation that should have taken 5 minutes maximum. Every part of his conduct was technically within policy, but the cumulative effect was making me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood for driving while black. That's what reforms need to address, not just the egregious incidents that make headlines, but the daily low-level harassment that treats black residents as suspects rather than citizens deserving respect and benefit of doubt. Marcus had shared that survey response and dozens of similar accounts with his command staff, challenging them to recognize how policies that seemed neutral in theory produced discriminatory outcomes in practice when applied by officers whose implicit bias shaped their perceptions of threat and their judgments about when suspicion was justified. We can't just train officers to follow policies and then assume equal outcomes will result if everyone follows the same rules, Marcus told his commanders during strategy session on next phase of reforms. We have to recognize that bias operates through discretionary decisions about when to stop someone, how to conduct that stop, how to interpret ambiguous behaviors, when to escalate versus de-escalate, when to give warnings versus citations versus arrests. Officers make hundreds of these discretionary decisions daily, and if implicit bias is shaping those decisions even unconsciously, then we get disparate outcomes even when officers believe they're treating everyone fairly and applying policies consistently. That's what the early intervention system and community surveys are designed to surface. Patterns that individual officers might not recognize in their own behavior, but that become undeniable when analyzed across multiple encounters over extended periods. The training reforms Marcus had implemented went far beyond traditional implicit bias workshops that officers could sit through passively, while remaining convinced their own policing was unaffected by racial assumptions. New training used scenario-based exercises, where officers encountered identical situations with suspects of different races and had to make split-second decisions about threat level, use of force, arrest versus citation, with their responses recorded and analyzed for patterns that might reveal unconscious bias, operating despite officers' beliefs about their own fairness. The exercises were uncomfortable and generated resistance from officers who resented having their judgment questioned or who claimed scenarios were designed to trap them into revealing bias rather than accurately reflecting real-world policing. But post-training assessments showed the experiential learning was more effective than lecture-based approaches at prompting officers to examine their own assumptions and recognize how bias might be operating in ways they'd never consciously acknowledged. "I hated that training," one veteran officer admitted during focus group assessing reform impacts. "It forced me to confront decisions I've been making for 20 years without really examining why I approach different situations differently based on who's involved. I still think I'm a fair cop who treats everyone with respect, but I can't deny that I'm quicker to assume threat when encountering black suspects, quicker to use command voice and assert authority, quicker to interpret ambiguous movements as potentially dangerous, requiring defensive response. I don't think that makes me racist in the sense of consciously hating black people, but I'm starting to understand that impact matters more than intent, that my assumptions are producing different outcomes for black community members, even when I don't mean to discriminate. It's uncomfortable knowledge, and I'm not sure I'm doing enough to change my behavior even though I recognize the problem now. But at least I can't pretend anymore that everyone gets treated the same regardless of race, because the data on my own stops and searches shows clear disparities that I can't explain away through circumstantial factors about neighborhoods or crime rates." The candid acknowledgement from a veteran officer suggested training was having intended effect of raising consciousness, even when immediate behavioral change remained incomplete. Marcus understood that transforming deeply ingrained patterns would take time and sustained effort, that awareness was necessary. First step, but insufficient endpoint. That systems of accountability were essential to ensure awareness translated into changed practices rather than just more sophisticated rationalizations for discriminatory outcomes. "We're not trying to make you feel guilty or convince you're bad people," Marcus told officers during department-wide meeting on 6-month reform assessment. "We're trying to make you conscious of how bias operates so you can make better decisions that align with your stated values of fair and equitable treatment. Most of you became police officers because you wanted to serve and protect, because you believed in justice and community safety, because you wanted to make positive difference in people's lives. Implicit bias undermines those goals by producing discriminatory outcomes that harm communities and destroy trust, even when individual officers believe they're doing good work. The reforms we've implemented aren't anti-police. They're pro-good policing, designed to help you be the officers you want to be, and to prevent incidents like my own arrest from happening to community members who don't have my protections and privileges." Jennifer Thompson, Marcus's wife, had watched her husband navigate 6 months of reform efforts while processing his own trauma from being arrested by his own officer, and she saw costs that Marcus tried to hide from public view. The nights he couldn't sleep reliving the humiliation of handcuffs applied by someone he'd trusted to uphold values he'd spent career promoting, the moments of doubt about whether transformation was possible or whether he was just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship, the emotional labor of maintaining professional composure while facing resistance from officers who resented accountability and skepticism from community members who doubted his commitment to change. "Marcus, you've given everything to these reforms for 6 months," Jennifer said during rare quiet evening at home. "You've made significant progress by any reasonable measure. Officers have been held accountable, policies have changed, transparency has increased, community has meaningful voice through the advisory commission. But I'm worried about what this is costing you personally, whether you're burning yourself out trying to fix problems that might be unfixable through individual leadership and good intentions. When do you get to step back and let other people carry more of the load? When do you get to process your own trauma instead of constantly using it as teaching moment for officers who should never have needed to arrest their chief to learn not to racially profile people?" Marcus didn't have good answer to her questions because he'd been avoiding confronting his own need for healing in favor of channeling experience into reform advocacy that felt more productive than sitting with pain and anger, that had no clear outlet or resolution. "I know I need to take care of myself better," he admitted. "I know I'm using work to avoid processing what happened and what it meant about my own limitations in protecting even myself from racism within institution I lead. But every time I think about slowing down or taking time for personal healing, I think about all the community members who experience similar treatment without any recourse. who don't have option of channeling trauma into institutional reform because they don't have power or platform to demand change? How do I prioritize my own healing when there's so much work left to do, and when my experience is one of the few levers we have for forcing accountability that the department can't easily dismiss or minimize? Jennifer understood her husband's logic but remained concerned about sustainability of his approach. You can't pour from empty cup, and you're running on fumes trying to transform a department while healing from trauma that same department inflicted. What happens when you finally crash? What happens when the accumulated stress and anger and exhaustion become too much, and you break in ways that can't be hidden or managed professionally? I'd rather you take time now to heal properly than wait until you're forced to step back, because you've pushed yourself to the point of complete breakdown. The reforms will survive your taking some time for yourself. If they can't survive that, then they're not sustainable anyway, and you'll have sacrificed your well-being for changes that evaporate as soon as you're not personally driving them forward through sheer force of will. Her argument was compelling, and Marcus knew she was right that he'd been avoiding his own emotional needs in favor of institutional priorities that could too easily consume all available energy without ever being fully resolved or completed. "I'll talk to someone," he promised. "I'll find a therapist who understands both policing and racial trauma. Someone who can help me process what happened without it becoming another performance or teaching moment. And I'll try to set better boundaries about what I can reasonably accomplish, and when I need to let go, and trust that reforms have enough momentum and institutional support to continue without my constant oversight and intervention. But I need you to understand that this work isn't just professional obligation for me anymore. It's personal in ways it never was before I experienced firsthand what community members face constantly. I can't just move on and pretend everything's fine when I know the problems are ongoing, and when I have power to at least try to make things better, even if I can't single-handedly solve systemic racism in policing." The one-year anniversary of Marcus's arrest approached with mixture of reflection on progress made and recognition of work still remaining, challenges that would extend far beyond Marcus's tenure as chief into generational struggle to transform policing from institution that too often perpetuated racism into force for genuine public safety and community well-being. The department planned commemoration event marking the anniversary as catalyst for reform rather than just embarrassing incident to be forgotten. Inviting community members to share their experiences with police and their observations about changes they'd witnessed over the past year. Marcus would speak at the event, but he'd insisted that community voices be centered rather than making it primarily about his personal experience, understanding that his arrest mattered mainly as leverage for demanding accountability that served people without his privileges and protections. 1 year ago, I was arrested by one of my own officers because he saw a black man in coveralls, and his implicit bias told him I couldn't possibly be the police chief despite credentials explicitly stating otherwise, Marcus planned to say in his remarks. That experience was humiliating and traumatic, forcing me to confront in deeply personal way the racism that black community members navigate daily in interactions with police. But my experience also provided leverage for demanding reforms that I'd been advocating for intellectually, but that gained urgency and political support once it became undeniable that racial profiling operated even within our own ranks, affecting even our own leadership. In the year since my arrest, we've implemented comprehensive changes to how we track officer behavior, how we train officers to recognize and interrupt bias, how we discipline misconduct, and how we incorporate community voice into oversight and accountability. Those changes have produced measurable improvements in some areas while revealing how much work remains in others. The data shows reduced disparities in stop rates and use of force for officers who've engaged seriously with training and accountability systems, but it also shows persistent problems with officers who resist reform and supervisors who protect problematic colleagues. Community surveys show some improvement in how police interactions are experienced, but they also show ongoing patterns of over-policing in black neighborhoods and underprotection when those same communities need police assistance with serious crimes. He would continue. The lesson of this past year is that reform is possible but not easy, that leadership commitment matters but isn't sufficient without institutional systems to ensure accountability persists beyond any individual leader's tenure. And that transformation requires sustained effort over years and decades, rather than expecting quick fixes to problems rooted in centuries of structural racism and multiple generations of discriminatory policing. I'm proud of progress we've made, But I'm under no illusion that we've solved problems that allowed my arrest to happen, or that we've eliminated all risk of similar incidents occurring to community members without my advantages. The work continues. The accountability systems we've built need constant maintenance and improvement, and the community voice we've incorporated into oversight needs ongoing amplification and respect, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging to department practices we've previously defended. I'm committed to that ongoing work for as long as I serve as chief, and I'm hopeful that we're building institutional changes that will outlast my tenure and continue evolving toward truly equitable policing that serves all community members with dignity and respect regardless of race. As Marcus stood before the mirror the night before the anniversary event, adjusting his dress uniform and examining his own weathered face marked by a year of intensified struggle and occasional hope, he thought about Derek Mitchell who'd arrested him, about Sarah Reeves who'd eventually intervened, about the countless community members who'd experienced similar or worse treatment without ever receiving acknowledgement or accountability, about the officers who'd embraced reforms and those who resisted them, about his wife's concerns for his well-being and his own unresolved trauma that had been channeled into advocacy rather than processed through healing. The journey was far from complete. The destination remained uncertain. But the past year had proven that change was possible when leadership had political will, when community maintained pressure, when systems were built to sustain accountability rather than relying on individual goodwill and good intentions. That was something, even if it wasn't everything, even if it fell short of the transformation that true justice would require, even if it protected only some people some of the time, rather than guaranteeing safety and dignity for everyone always. Chief Thompson's story forces us to ask, if someone with his credentials and authority wasn't protected from racial profiling, what hope do ordinary citizens have? And for those who've witnessed discrimination but stayed silent, whether in policing or any other field, what finally gave you courage to speak up, or what still holds you back? Share your reflections below. If this story moved you, please subscribe and help us build a community that believes real accountability requires sustained effort, that leadership means being willing to transform your own trauma into catalyst for systemic change, and that the work of justice is never finished but always worth continuing. What conversations do we need next? What stories help us imagine the transformation we're fighting for? Thank you for being here and for believing that we can build institutions worthy of the communities they're meant to serve.